Hey folks, so my last video got way more attention than my teeny tiny channel usually gets. I'm still feeling a little overwhelmed, to be honest, but I wanted to thank everyone who watched the video. If you're new around here, this is a writing channel where we discuss writing and try to improve our craft. In the last video, I talked about why I, as a writer, felt that the writing for Rook in Dragon Age the Veilguard was a bit weak. I presented these 3 points and suggested that in the vast majority of stories out there, a well-written protagonist should be able to tick off at least one of these. The reason for that is that a protagonist is not just an interesting person doing interesting things. A protagonist is a tool specifically designed to help us tell the story that we are trying to tell in the most compelling way we can. The protagonist is the lens through which we view a story, and they should be the best lens possible to highlight and magnify the message the story is trying to tell us. Which means that, by design, a good protagonist should have qualities that set them apart from other characters in the story. Qualities that turn them into the best tool to get the job done. So I made this list to test if our own protagonists are centered in their own story and pulling their own weight. But I did want to clarify that your protagonist doesn't necessarily need to tick off all of these points. And a protagonist who can tick off all 3 isn't necessarily better written than a protagonist who can only tick off 1. It all depends on the needs of the story. But if your protagonist can't tick off any of these points, then there's a very good chance you need to sharpen them into a better tool by finding ways to ground them in their own story. Creating a protagonist who can carry an entire story on their back is hard, and so much more involved than these 3 criteria I presented. This was just a very basic litmus test. This was Protagonists 101. So naturally, I got several comments on that video that warranted a deeper discussion than that video was ever really intended for. Now that I've had a bit of a holiday break, I thought I would pull up some of the comments and dig a little deeper. Now, no hate to this commenter, they were polite, and I'm just using their comment to springboard off of because they make several points that were very common, and they do it all in one convenient place for me to address. So, this commenter suggests that Rook does satisfy all the points on the litmus test, to which I'd say, no, Rook almost fits the 3 criteria, which tells me that the writers were aware they needed to center Rook in this story and made some effort to do so, which is good. However, in what is a bit of a theme with the writing in Veilguard, the effort invested was, to use a technical term, wishy-washy. There are some really good parts to the story, but the bulk of the writing feels like an early draft. Veilguard had some really good ideas, but didn't nurture or refine them. It didn't work out the kinks well enough. In every single case for the litmus test, the writing for Veilguard and for Rook ends up getting in its own way until what the writers had intended to use to check off these criteria no longer function. I'm going to go point by point here and explain what I mean, but because we are going deeper in this discussion, in this video, I'm only going to respond to this first point here, but let's get into it. The first thing this person brings up is they think that Rook does have a personal connection to the story at hand because they'd already been hunting Solace with Varric for a year, so why wouldn't they keep going? First off, if you ever find yourself asking, why not, in regard to a character's major choices and behavior, that may be a pretty good indicator of weak writing. You shouldn't have to ask why not because you should already know the answer to why. Why is a lot more compelling than why not. Second, this just is not the kind of personal connection we're talking about here. The kind of personal connection we're looking for is something internal. We're looking for a deep emotional or ideological connection that tells us something about who Rook is as a person, what they value, what they want, and most importantly, why. Not why not. We're looking for a connection that compels Rook to act in the story, not just because they might as well, but because they can't not get involved. What we're really talking about here is the character's motivation, what drives them forward.
Well, you're a hero. I mean, a real one. So why are you doing all this?
It's one of the most important aspects to define for a protagonist. In the last video, I showed clips from The Mentalist. This is Patrick Jane, who uses his skills in psychological manipulation to help the CBI solve cases in exchange for them keeping him informed on a serial killer known as Red John. Why? Because back when Jane used to use his skills to pretend to be psychic for money and ego, he went on live television and openly belittled Red John, attracting the attention and rage of a narcissistic monster.
Red John. He's an ugly, tormented little man. A lonely soul. Sad.
Who then murdered Jane's wife and daughter in retaliation. This is a personal connection. This sets Jane apart from other characters in the story because he is compelled to go after Red John in a way other characters are not. He's compelled by a deep sense of love and loss, guilt, and the ideological belief that he is entitled to murderous revenge. He can't not go after Red John. This personal connection tells us that Jane is intelligent but egotistical. He takes risks without considering consequences. He will manipulate and extort others for personal gain, and he has a sense of entitlement with a capacity for brutal violence. But it also tells us he has a tender, loving, and protective side, so that's nice. But the fact that Varric hired Rook to help him hunt Solis for a year doesn't say anything meaningful about Rook, because we don't know why Rook accepted the job. Maybe Rook genuinely believed in the cause, but for all we know, Rook was simply there for the paycheck after their faction put them in a timeout. Maybe Rook just wanted to knit sweaters out of Varric's chest hair and open up an Etsy shop. Maybe Rook has a thing for bald elves and wanted to shoot their shot. We don't know. Even Rook's backstory is only vaguely heroic and doesn't say much about their values or motives. You can guess at what Rook's values and motivations might be. You might even be able to make an educated guess, but you can't know, because Rook isn't a fully developed character. If you feel that this is enough of a personal connection, then you likely feel that way because you are imagining a heroic version of Rook that has the qualities you want to see. But that doesn't mean those qualities were ever adequately established or explored by the writing in a meaningful way. So you might be surprised when I tell you that doesn't have to be a bad thing for a game like Dragon Age. While we typically do expect protagonists in most forms of media to have a well-established motivation, in some RPGs where the gamers create their own character, developers may not want to tell you too much about who your character is because your imagination is helping the developers to flesh them out. You're doing some of the work for them, so they create opportunities to nurture your imagination, but otherwise they try not to conflict with how you view your character. For that reason, a lot of RPGs like Dragon Age may avoid meeting the first criteria on this list altogether and instead focus on nailing the second or third options. Which is exactly what Inquisition did, by putting more focus on how vital the anchor was to saving the world and how you were the only one who had the anchor, while barely establishing anything about your Inquisitor's personality, values, or backstory. That didn't stop a lot of people from getting really attached to who they imagined their Inquisitors to be. Inquisition allows you to choose a personal motivation for yourself when you're named Inquisitor. It's one of those moments the game uses to nurture your imagination of your character. Veilguard also allows you to decide Rook's motivation.
Well, you're a hero. I mean, a real one. So why are you doing all this?
Albeit they do this much too late in the game, give you a very poor selection of options, and then give even those options very weak dialogue.
Well, I've done some things in my past I'm not proud of. Nothing too terrible, but some of it was bad.
But the bigger difference between the two games here is that Inquisition, for the most part, offered you choices like this to facilitate your imagination. Then the game got the heck out of your way, allowing your imagination to flourish and for you to define your Inquisitor for yourself. But Veilguard gets in the way of your imagination because it occupies this sticky middle ground where they don't make Rook a fully realized character, but they also don't allow you to make Rook your own. Rook comes with a pre-established personality that cannot be changed through dialogue choices, but they are not given well-defined values, strengths, weaknesses, or motivations. What we're left with is a hollow, wishy-washy character. Their generic hero, TM. If the Rook that you were trying to play fit well into that mold, you likely had a much better experience with the game than other players did. But if your Rook ever tries to step out from the generic hero mold, the game walls you in and inhibits your imagination, just like it did when I tried to make my Rook feel guilty for releasing the gods. You're playing BioWare's Rook, not yours, but they only tell you a very limited amount about who that Rook is. Most Dragon Age fans expected to have more control over their character, just as they have in past Dragon Age games. It probably would have been best for BioWare to deliver on that, but if they weren't going to allow gamers to mold their own Rook, it would have made more sense to fully develop Rook and give them a compelling personal motivation to stop the gods. And this why not scenario is not compelling. But this commenter suggests that guilt doesn't have to be the only personal stake for Rook. But again, if we as writers were to flesh Rook out and canonize a personal connection for them, it kind of actually does have to be guilt. To understand the reason for that, we have to go back to what I said earlier. A protagonist should be the best lens possible to magnify the message the story is trying to send. That means your protagonist's motivation and personal quest through the story need to convey the story's themes. If Protagonist's 101 is that a protagonist should be able to pass this litmus test, then Protagonist's 201 is that your protagonist should be able to pass this litmus test in a thematic way. Your protagonist's personal connection should relate to the themes. Whatever special skill or perspective they have that makes them qualified to tackle the problem of the story should, in some way, relate to the themes. If no one else is stepping up to handle the problem, the reason why they aren't should relate to the themes. We're going to talk more about Veilguard's themes in a later video, so for now, I'll just point out that Veilguard is trying to teach us a lesson about regret. The game weaves together heavy-handed themes about guilt.
Hey, let's not get stuck in our regrets, all right?
Then that's his regret. No wonder regret eats away at Solus.
That guilt.
I feel guilty.
Do you regret it?
I live with countless regrets.
He's been trapped by his mistakes for eons.
Regret, like all emotions, is a powerful thing.
It's made from regrets, and you're trapped in yours.
The entire plot structure of the game, everything from the catalyst, where Rook unleashes the gods, to what we would call the Dark Night of the Soul moment, where Rook is stuck in the Fade prison and must face their regrets. All of this plot structure is specifically designed to have a protagonist who feels guilty for setting the gods free. If we were to take the gamer's choice away from them and decide on Rook's motivation, then guilt is about the only personal motivation that works with the way this narrative is currently structured. If Solus, our main antagonist, was meant to represent the dangerous side of guilt, then sometimes it feels like the writers wanted Rook, as the hero, to occupy the other side of the spectrum and exemplify a healthy relationship with guilt. Sometimes it feels like the writers didn't want Rook to make those kinds of mistakes or feel that kind of toxic regret. But what we get instead of a character with a healthy balance is someone on the other extreme. We get a character who feels like a hypocrite, chastising Solus for his cataclysmic decisions while lacking self-awareness of their own disastrous choices. Even when in the Fade prison, where Rook is supposed to face their deepest regrets, what Rook regrets are bad things that happened to people they cared about. Not bad actions they took themselves.
I deal with blood magic. I can stop the damage long enough to burn out the wards.
That's risky, Nev. Really risky.
I trusted you, and it got me killed.
Elgernon and Gillenane are suspiciously absent from Rook's regret prison, only referenced in passing.
So I promise you this. I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to stop Elgernon, and I'm going to stop Solus.
Releasing the gods is not a guilt Rook is forced to face, despite being the entire catalyst and premise of the story. So what few opportunities Rook is given to express guilt throughout the game ring incredibly hollow. Sometimes Rook themselves will immediately walk back their own guilt.
I've had those same feelings. That guilt. but it hasn't been like that for centuries. And it isn't who we are now.
While it is entirely possible to write a story with a protagonist who already knows the truth that the story is trying to teach, what exactly is the point of this crucial scene in the game if Rook has no lesson to learn? Why have Rook face and overcome their regrets in the Fade prison at all? It feels like the prison has no hold over Rook, not because they learned something important, but because they are simply incapable of true remorse. It would have made more sense to show us not a Rook who already understands how toxic certain types of guilt can be, but a Rook who becomes an example of how to have a healthy relationship with guilt through acknowledging, facing, and overcoming toxic guilt over the course of the story. So we see here that the writing for Veilguard gets in its own way. The game needed to get out of this murky middle and commit, either to letting the gamer take control of their own character, or to fully developing a three-dimensional Rook complete with strengths, weaknesses, and compelling personal motivations. If BioWare wanted to give the gamer control, then they needed to do a better job at getting out of the gamer's way. They should have given the gamers more freedom to define Rook's personality and motivations without contradicting the gamer's choices. But if Veilguard wanted to develop Rook into a complete character and meet this first criteria, then Rook's personal connection to the story should be guilt, which means Rook needs to be allowed to make mistakes that the game recognizes as mistakes. The game needs to stop walking back Rook's guilt and instead embrace it, highlight it. But the game pushes back on gamers who are trying to make their Rook feel guilty. The game pushes back on gamers who are trying to help Veilguard tell a fuller story than it's telling. So in the end, Rook can't really tick off this point in any meaningful, satisfying way. But like I said before, not all protagonists have to be able to tick off every point here. Rook still has 2 chances to ground themselves in this story. Surely there's something to center Rook as the protagonist of this game. Well, we're going to finish addressing the rest of this comment in future videos, but if you liked this one, you know the drill. If you like discussions about writing, this is a decent enough place to be. Hang around, and I'll see you next time.